So, to begin with, I'd like to introduce Professor Pal before I hand it over to Pushkar to take over the rest of the proceedings. So, again, Professor Pal is the Executive Director of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University. He's also the Professor of Economics in the Rawls College of Business and a Senior Fellow with the Independent Institute. He's Secretary Treasurer of both the Southern Economic Association and the Association of Private Enterprise Education and the Treasurer of the Mont Pelerin Society. Now, Professor Pal is also the author of Out of Poverty, Sweatshops in the Global Economy, co author of Wretched Refuse, The Political Economy of Immigration and Institutions, and also of a very best selling book, Socialism Sucks, which you can see here on the thumbnail. Now, Dr. Pal's research findings have been cited numerous times, almost 4,000 times in other scholarly studies, and reported in hundreds of popular press outlets. He has also appeared on numerous radio and television shows and was a regular guest commentator on Fox Business's Freedom Watch and Stossel. So, with that, Pushkar, you can introduce the society and take over the rest of the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anshu. It is indeed a delight for me that Professor Powell agreed to address Caucus. So, Caucus was formed in 2007, and we started off as a society to discuss international relations. We started off as a model United Nations society, and since then, we have diversified extremely. And a glimpse at the list of events we have conducted recently should drive this point home. We have hosted sessions on science, on culture, on history, and of course on economics. Everything depends on economics in some sense or the other. You have to have a livelihood in order to be able to engage in the more profound avenues of human enterprise. What's interesting about today's session, today's theme, sort of the reason behind why Anshu and I decided on this topic, is that India grew up in the wake of colonialism. The post-colonial Indian state, at least, grew up in the wake of colonialism, and there was this perennial fear of engaging in trade, which manifested itself right from economic nationalists who wanted a closed off, inward oriented development. And they drove home the point of such an economic perspective or outlook through rhetoric of nationalism that the British came and looted us and so on. But the other part, which is equally important, at least to me, is the fact that the economy was centrally planned. Even though it may not have been a command economy, it may not have been command planning, it was consensual planning. And even after 91, it seems to me the moment we see points about import substitution, industrialization, and we see the Indian bureaucracy trying to increase taxes from maybe 28% to 35% and so on, it reminds us of the relevance of questioning the extent of power that's granted to the state in order to engage in such kind of planning. We started off by hosting Professor Tirthankar Roy this semester. He's also famous critic of such inward-oriented understandings of the Indian economy. We hosted Professor Goyal to better understand networks because networks are also key to understanding how decentralized knowledge is. And today we have the privilege of hosting Professor Powell, who will be taking on in a much more vociferous manner the sort of dogma of centralized planning that has dominated our thinking. So thank you very much, Professor Powell, for agreeing to do this event. And I would request you to start off with your opening remarks. Thank you so much, Professor Powell.
All right. Thank you, Pushkar and Anshu. Pleased to be with you this morning for me, this evening for you. I noticed that Anshu had a more politically correct title for my talk for all of you of Economics and Liberty Lessons from Central Planning, which is descriptively accurate, but not nearly as fun as Socialism Sucks. Two economists drink their way through the unfree world. As we were saying before we started, this project is very different than most of my academic work that I've done. It got started kind of for two reasons. A very US-centric, actually, reason for starting intellectually was in 2016, socialism, which we thought was dead as an intellectual idea, at least in the United States, was back and popular again. It was right on the heels of a presidential campaign where one of the Democratic candidates claims to be a democratic socialist and nearly won the election. It was also seeing polls coming out of young people asking them what their favorite economic system was, and more of them favoring socialism than capitalism. So we wanted to do something that was different than our boring academic journal articles and try to reach different audiences. The other reason was my co-author on this, Bob Lawson, who is at Southern Methodist University, he somebody's not on mute. Uh, he wanted to go get drunk in Cuba, and my wife didn't really just want me going on vacation with him. So I said, I've got an idea for a book. I don't know if we can pull this off because it's writing in a very different style than we usually do. But let's go to Cuba for a while and we'll write it up and give it to normal people and see what they think. And if it's gets a good reaction, well, then we can outline the rest of the book. And that's what became Socialism Sucks. And it actually wasn't originally subtitled Two Economists Drink Their Way Through the Unfree World with the beers on the cover like that. That actually evolved as we were writing it because it's a Anthony Bourdain style firsthand travel log that accurately describes what we were doing there, and there was a fair bit of drinking in it. But it turns out that the alcohol in the book actually works as a metaphor for how economies are functioning. Of what's going on in that industry is indicative of kind of the wider economic trends. So it ended up evolving into this eventually. So here's the tour that we do in the book, and India is not on there, and I'll save any remarks about India until we do the guided discussion here. Because if we had done a second edition, we were considering adding a chapter on India then. So tour goes through not socialism in Sweden, starving socialism in Venezuela, subsistence socialism in Cuba, Korea, China, Russia, Ukraine, the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, and then we end it back in the USSA at the largest socialist conference in the United States. I think probably since I'm only talking for about 20 minutes here today with you before we do the questions, I'll mostly talk about some lessons from Venezuela and Cuba, and maybe a little bit on Georgia, and I'll be pretty light on the rest of it. And Pushkar and Anshu can draw out whatever they want in Q&A from those. But first, we need to define our terms here. So socialism means something. It meant something to Marx. It meant something to Lenin. It meant something to numerous economists over the last 100 years who have debated how socialist economic systems work. So it means abolishing private property in the major factors of production. Your factories, your resources, and for that matter, your labor, you are part of the means of production. Instead of them being private property and privately owned, there has to be some form of collective ownership. Now, in practice, for any large-scale society, this means de facto state ownership and control over the major factors of production. But you can have smaller-scale socialism, things like the kibbutzes in Israel, which again would have gone into a second edition. But also even just your family is a kind of socialist unit that actually does something along the lines of from each according to their ability to each according to their need. I have a high school boy at home. He gets all sorts of snacks out of the closet. We don't have a market where we charge him each time he takes a snack. Instead, we fill it with things and then we allocate to people kind of as they need. But notice, by the way, that the family unit, for the most part, isn't a productive unit. It's a consumption unit, which is very different. And you're out each selling your labor in the marketplace where it is private property and then doing a collective sharing at home. It's a huge mistake to take norms of small group social settings and try to extend them to the larger social order where the same incentives and information are not there. In the family, everybody basically cares about each other, loves each other. That's not true across the bigger society. And for that matter, the informational problems that we have to solve in order to organize our consumption are trivial compared to the information problems required to organize production across an entire society. So, with that as a working definition to get started, de facto basically state ownership of the means of production for any large-scale society. If you're going to replace private property, which generates prices, profit, and loss, and generates the information to coordinate our economic activity and incentivizes us to serve our fellow man, we have to replace it with something else. There is no just socialism from the bottom up or let the workers decide. Because what if the workers at a tire factory make 16-inch tires, but the workers at the rim factory make 18-inch rims? We need some way to reconcile this. In markets, prices would do this. Shortages and surpluses would incentivize people to change. Without that, someone else has to be in control. And that usually means state central planning of the economy, replacing market coordination through prices and entrepreneurial decision-making with a central plan. So with that in mind, Sweden is not a socialist economy. So this is one that's popular for people in the United States to say that they favor democratic socialism like Sweden or Norway or basically any Scandinavian country. But they're all very capitalist countries. So my co-author, Bob Lawson, he is also the co-author of the Economic Freedom of the World annual report, which basically ranks countries on a scale of 1 to 10 of how economically free you are. For our purposes, if we want to say it, basically on a scale of 0 being complete socialism, 10 being complete capitalism, where on the spectrum one falls on that. And by the way, there's never been a completely 100% private property capitalist economy, and there's never been a completely 100% collectively owned economy. Probably the Soviet Union during war communism in the early 1920s, before they put in the new economic policy, or China under Mao and the Great Leap Forward. Those would be the most complete collectivizations. But when we look at this with Sweden, they're the 27th freest in the world. They're basically a free market economy that's just not perfectly free. And where aren't they? They have a big welfare state, and they have to have big taxes to pay for their welfare state. But those aren't the same thing as socialism. Now, they do have economic consequences. Sweden was very free market from the mid 19th century to the mid 20th century. It grew rapidly, becoming, I believe, the fourth wealthiest nation in the world. And since it put it in its big welfare state, growth slowed, and now they're in the bottom half of OECD countries for per capita income. I think that's a problem, but I think reasonable people might disagree about having a large social safety net and high taxes with slow growth, or vice versa. This is very different than the trade-offs you face of capitalism versus socialism. So let's say a little bit about Venezuela, because I think this is the most interesting recent experience with something that's socialism or near socialism. So I want two big lessons that I'm going to want to take away on this one is one, how did it look prosperous? And two, the relationship between political freedoms and economic freedoms. So it's not an accident that almost all examples of socialist countries throughout history have been totalitarian dictatorships. Venezuela was kind of an outlier. So Chavez came to power in 1998. He had tried to come to power through a military coup, originally went to jail, got out of jail, but then he was democratically elected in 1998 in what was basically, as these things go, a free and fair election. International observers certified it. He was reelected running on a platform of Bolivarian socialism after Simon Bolivar, the revolutionary during independence from Spain, and put in a new constitution implementing these policies. And in the 2000s, in the United States, this was the example that everybody who liked socialism pointed to. They said, look at Venezuela. This is successful democratic socialism. So it's not a dictatorship, and it's doing well economically. And if you looked at just the statistics, it did kind of look okay. So incomes were going up, child mortality was going down, poverty was going down, literacy was going up, and people said, see, this is successful. Except it wasn't actually its own economy that was making it a success. So Venezuela sits on the world's largest oil reserves. What was happening to oil markets in the 2000s? Big demand, in part from your country, growth in India and growth in China, before we've had the fracking revolution that radically increased oil supplies. This pushed oil prices up. As a result, Venezuela, remember, government ownership of the means of production. The government owns the oil and the oil company. The government was exporting oil, earning a lot of foreign exchange, and importing goodies to give out to its people. This wasn't internally socialist prosperous. So when you actually look at this, and some of my colleagues here at Texas Tech have looking at what should Venezuela have been doing, you can basically create a weighted average of other countries that are in Latin America or produce oil and see what they were doing prior to 1998 and sync up that weighted average to perfectly measure what Venezuela is doing. And then we could say, after they get socialism, how does this basket of countries weighted average do compared to Venezuela? Basically creating a fake Venezuela to compare the real one against. And what they find is, well, incomes went up in Venezuela. They did not go up as much as they should have. And while mortality went down, didn't go down as much as it should have. Basically, they underperformed on most of these margins. And interestingly, they didn't overperform in inequality either. So it was really actually what they did improve on inequality, but without improving as much on incomes, which means what they were doing was destroying the top of the distribution without raising the bottom up relative to the counterfactual. Now, eventually, oil production, actually, so government ownership of the means of production, the state ownership was corrupt and putting the wrong people in power and not incentivizing reinvestment in capital correctly. And as a result, the oil production, even though they sit on the world's largest reserves, production went down. And then in the early 2000 teens, when the fracking revolution fully came on, oil prices went down. All of a sudden, they couldn't import enough. They couldn't earn enough foreign exchange to import. And as a result, you have the humanitarian crisis that we see in Venezuela still today. When we visited in 2017, which we were on the Colombian-Venezuela border and went into Venezuela illegally for a little while, but we're mostly observing, as you can see, this thousands of people every day crossing the bridge into Colombia, either to immigrate, as you see in the top when they're going into the official checkpoint, or to just buy basic supplies, which you can see in the bottom right, and lugging it back to Venezuela in their luggage and suitcase. And if you look at this, these are not, and you in India have seen differences. This is not your impoverished people. This was Venezuelans who were middle class, upper middle class workers who had some resources where they could still get out here and buy something. And it's indicative of the clothing they're wearing and the luggage that they're dragging. You don't see this from the truly impoverished in poorer countries. The truly impoverished in Venezuela were losing weight and starving. I think the average Venezuelan lost something like 17 pounds in the year that we visited. They didn't all of a sudden discover diet pills. This is an economy that can't feed itself. And in fact, throughout the 2000s, when it appeared to be prosperous, food production in Venezuela was actually collapsing. It's just they were importing food with the foreign exchange from oil. So first lesson takeaway from Venezuela. It was not successful socialism economically. It was unsuccessful. It was just that that lack of success was masked for a while because of the big oil reserves. Second lesson, Venezuela is no longer politically free. So he came to power in democratic elections and was popular for a while. But since this humanitarian crisis has been going on, so Maduro is his successor, and they have ceased to be democratic for quite a while. This summer was the most dramatic example. In the most recent election, the government just basically told them what the vote tally was and allows nobody to verify it and see any records from it. And the opposition candidate was widely expected to slaughter Maduro, and instead it shows Maduro overwhelmingly winning. This was true in the last election too, but they were doing things like if you work for a government company, you're ordered to vote for the regime or you lose your job. They'd put food aid out by polling places, and if you vote correctly, then you get food aid. But now it's just outright fraud of making up what the elections are. And in fact, in between these two elections, the legislature had appointed an interim president, Guiardo, I believe was his name, as they're constitutionally allowed to do. And the military and Maduro just said, no, he's not coming to power. So democratic socialism has ceased to be democratic and is becoming mere socialism. And I would say this is not an accident. I mean, thinking about the economic outcomes in Venezuela, they have the world's second highest ever inflation rate. You have people losing weight. Usually, if you have high unemployment and high inflation, that's a good way to get kicked out of office. If you have hyperinflation and people starving and a huge refugee crisis, how is it that you actually win an election? So this is a problem with democratic socialism. So usually you see economic freedom in the political and civil sphere tend to go together. You see some outliers, places like a Hong Kong or a Singapore that are economically free but don't have political freedoms. The ones that aren't economically free but politically free, those are the really rare ones. And Venezuela was that very temporarily, but soon it lost its political freedoms. And I'd say that this is not an accident. Given the information and incentives of a socialist economic system, you're necessarily going to stagnate your economy. And when you do, voters would kick you out of office. If you allow that democratic process to work, your country will cease to be socialist because they'll vote in a reformer. Or since you have monopolized control over the means of production, you can punish your political opposition economically, threaten their economic livelihood, and take away other freedoms. and you cease to be democratic and you remain socialist. And that's what Venezuela is today. So let's talk about Cuba a little bit. And this is what started the book project, and it's also the best place in the world to go around and see a functioning, dysfunctioning socialist economy, where we can see differences in incentives and information and how it changes economic outcomes. The a lot of things in Cuba, as you spend time there, things seem a little bit off, and the trick is kind of figuring out why. And it's not that because Cuba's poor, but it's because they're centrally planned, seeing the difference between these. So let me give you a few kind of just mundane economic transactions pictures and talk about differences between market incentives and socialist ones in centrally planned Cuba. So when we first went there, we stayed at the Hotel Trinton, which was open in 1979. It has that centrally planned style architecture. You can see it's considerably less gleamingly white in the picture we took when we got there. You can also see, if you look carefully, a bunch of broken windows and glass up near the top. You can see the height of the building. When we get there, there's 4 elevators. You can see the SER going across one of them. 3 of them are out of service. And in fact, they didn't have a record of our hotel reservation, which, by the way, you can't not use American credit cards in Cuba. So we had to book with a British company who pays them on their behalf, on our behalf, and then tells them that we have a reservation, which they said no reservation when we got there. We solved this by handing them money. Go to a hotel room. It's missing panels in the bathroom. There's mold on the toilets. We stayed in another one, Hotel Carib in downtown Havana. This one is on the coast in the suburb of Havana. Hotel Carib is in downtown near the seat of government. And you can see the glass that comes out of the sanitary bag that's not actually sanitary, holes in the towel. If you look at that toilet, you can see the bolt is missing on the seat. So if you get on it, you kind of just like slide, which if you make a mess, it's nice because they left you the previous guest soap so that you could clean yourself up with it. You've all probably had the experience of staying in a hotel and waking up and having no hot water because everybody was using hot water at the same time. I certainly have. What I hadn't until I stayed at Hotel Trinton was experience a hotel with no water at all. Woke up one morning and there was no water. Turns out in Cuba, musicians earn about the same amount as plumbers. As a result, playing music is fun and there's plenty of musicians, but you get a lot of clogged drains and toilets because no one wants to do that shitty job. Contrast that with this is what they call casa particular. So people who have a right to live in their apartment, they don't have a property right in it to sell it the way that we have normal property rights, but they do have an attenuated property right where they can rent it out for profit. So you can rent people's private residences. This is a 2-bedroom. You can kind of see the 2 doors going into a bedroom, 2 bedrooms, kitchenette, living room in downtown central Havana. And we booked it on Airbnb, which is impressive again, because your credit cards don't work, but also the internet basically doesn't work in Cuba. But what most Cubans have is relatives who live in Miami who list their properties on Airbnb, and you pay their relative in Miami and they call their relative in Cuba who actually is there to meet you when you get there and is at the door. And this Casa Particular was very nice. You can see it's well kept. It had hot water, good air conditioning, great location. Why the difference? And by the way, in terms of price, the hotel was about 65 US dollars. That's about the same price as this 2-bedroom Casa Particular. What's the difference? Well, one of them has a version of private property rights where they retain some profits. As a result, they reinvest their meager profits for upkeep and try to attract more customers. In the other one, no one gives a damn. As a result, things deteriorate and nobody cares. Just a difference in incentive doing the same service. Look around Havana for some other things. So top left corner, this is a busy commercial street. Pause and look at it for a second. What's missing? Obviously cars, but this one's a pedestrian street, so I'll get to cars in a minute. But there's no signs. I've been to plenty of countries, plenty of poor countries. There's always signs. Why aren't there signs in Havana? Government ownership of the means of production. All the stores are government owned. No one gives a shit if you come in. In fact, if you're a customer, you're a mild inconvenience. So why put a sign out to encourage you to come in? In fact, this made it tough because Bob and I tend to just walk around, observe things, interact with people, and then grab a beer and then repeat. And we'd get to a street corner and would look, any place that sells a beer down there? I don't know. Only way to find out is to walk down the street because there's no damn signs. Go to any other country in the world, no matter how poor they are, you'll find signs. In fact, the beer company will give a place a sign to put out in front if they're selling their beer. Next one, store on the upper right. What's wrong with that picture? This is a well-stocked convenience store. Note, by the way, I'm taking a picture from the outside because it's illegal to take pictures inside the stores. That's a well-stocked one. What's wrong? Well, when you look, there might be 24, maybe, distinct items. Everything's the same. There's one type of cola. It's kind of down there on the bottom. I called it Commie Cola. That wasn't its real name. But there's only one type of cola in all of Cuba. There's kind of one type of each product. You know, in the United States, Bernie Sanders, the politician who calls himself a democratic socialist, he'll say things like, capitalism is wasteful. Why do we need 17 types of deodorant? And most people will be like, yeah, I only use one type of deodorant. Well, yes, but there's 17 other people who use different types. But for a lot of goods, we value variety. I value being able to have different beverages. In Cuba, there's only two types of beer, Bucanero and Cristal. They're both about 4.5% alcohol and taste like an American Budweiser that you left out in the sun a little bit too long. There's no variety. Why is there no variety? Well, one, the central planners don't care. They're just trying to deliver product. And two, they don't have the information of exactly the product variety type mix that market prices generate. So they're simplifying their economic problem of trying to just produce product category instead of granulated, differentiated products within that category. And this comes through in your consumption in Cuba. These bottom two pictures are private restaurants. So there are plenty of state restaurants and they're god awful. But there are private ones. So again, this is on the continuum. Cuba's pretty far on the socialist end of the continuum, but they allow various types of market transactions and private property. And one of them is in restaurants. Originally, I think you had to have 8 seats or fewer. I think now it's like 50, something like that. And the private restaurants, just like the Casa Particulares, their incentives are right. They're trying, but they're dealing with the state supply chain. As a result, every private restaurant has about the same menu and about the same prices. There's about a dozen to 18 different things you can order, and they're all bland. Cuban food in Miami is delicious. A Cuban sandwich there is fantastic. A Cuban sandwich in Havana is a shitty ham and cheese. There's essentially no spice to anything. So they try, but they're limited by the state chain. Last thing I'll end on Cuba with this is their cars. This also illustrates you have private property in cars. Now, they'll say that the US has a blockade, but there is no US destroyers preventing anybody from dropping off Kias in Cuba. It's the Cuban government who limits imports of cars and allocates them as political favors to the elite so that everybody else has to use crappy old cars. As a result, prices go astronomically high. In a country that has probably, and I say probably because income statistics in a socialist country aren't accurate, probably somewhere around $2,500 to $3,000 per person income. A crappy Renault, like is in the front of this picture, would go for about $30,000, about 10 times average income. Those old 1950s cars, which is in the background on this, is more like about 15,000. So in Cuba, if there's a theme of what things you can sell in markets, it's the price is wrong. And it's because they're not integrated into the international price structure. So I think I've used up most of the 20 minutes talking about those countries, which is perfectly fine by me. Because with North Korea, we have to go up and down the border. With China, we didn't really go in. Part of the instructions from our wives was we weren't allowed to get killed or imprisoned while doing this book project. And I run a free market institute, and Bob runs O'Neill Center for Economic Freedom. We're not exactly friends of the state of North Korea. But I will give you just one picture from it, because, by the way, the contrast between North and South Korea, this one is, it's rare where you have a natural experiment of same people, same history, same language, same culture, same geography, And one of them gets an economic system that's mostly capitalist, one gets one that's mostly socialist. And 60 years later, you can look at the development differences, and this picture says it all. Of South Korea is lit up and prosperous at night, North Korea is dark and poor. And in fact, that's exactly what you see from your hotel room when you're there. This is in Dandong, China, in the northern border. You can see in the top left the three arches kind of going over a bridge. That's the same picture in daylight to the right. And you can see the lights you see on the top left picture are all in China. Across the river, across those three arches is all dark. But you can see with light, there's actually a 300,000 person city here. It's the major export city from North Korea. But much like the satellite, it's completely dark at night. Why don't I, Pushkar and Anshu, want me to stop there and you can guide the discussion and weave in any of the other countries in the book that you want?
So I think you can continue for a while on Korea and then we can take over with the discussion.
Well, I'll just sum up with Korea that so at the end of the Korean War, the whole peninsula was decimated, right? The North Koreans had driven the South Koreans all the way back to the bottom of the peninsula. Then the US intervenes, drives them all the way up to the Chinese border. Then China intervenes. They end up with a peace at the 38th parallel. The entire peninsula is decimated. And North Korea adopts a socialist economic system. South Korea adopts a mostly capitalist one that eventually gets some more democratic freedoms, although things were sketchy there this week of what I'm reading. And see it play out. North Korea today has an average income of probably $2,000 or less. In the 1990s, when they lost Soviet aid, more than 1 million people starved to death. Meanwhile, South Korea has per capita incomes around $40,000, is rich, prosperous, well-functioning economy. There's your natural experiment. If you want a natural experiment, you don't compare the Soviet Union and the United States because there's a whole bunch of other things that are different between them. But in the Korean Peninsula, you've got a place that's pretty much the same, two different economic systems, two drastically different outcomes. And I will, I guess, wrap up there. That's a short version of Korea, but that's fine. And we can talk about China and if we want to talk about reform, Georgia, when we're having a discussion. So I'll escape out of here. And can you end my share?
Just a moment, sir. I think you'll have to undo it from your side, but stop.
Oh, I got it.
Huh.
There we go. Sorry, it was the transcribe tab was covering the button, so I couldn't see it.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much, sir. There's a lot of ground that you covered in your PowerPoint, and we'll try as far as possible to cover the numerous issues that you have discussed. To start off with, on a very brief and a very preliminary note, at the beginning you point out how during the 2016 elections in the United States there was kind of a resurgence among the youth, especially, of support for a socialist model of planning the economy. Now, I've read a bit about Adam Smith and the times that he lived in, and what stands out is that Adam Smith and classical economists had a strong normative view as well about the manner or the cultural milieu in which people are exercising the regency, which also influences how they get together to make decisions in the marketplace. Now, what seems to me to be the case in the United States, but not just in the United States, is that there is the absence of a strong normative, or should I call it ideological or cultural background against, let's say, a laissez-faire view of the economy. So how would you talk about, let's say, and you mentioned this when you talk about the family and how, all right, there's love in the family, everyone loves each other, and this is not necessarily the way across the country. So how do you see the link between, let's say, a cultural factors and the way the market unfolds itself?
Yeah, so I'd say actually, particularly since you have your interest in Adam Smith, the link to the family versus the extended order is a great paper by Vernon Smith called "The Two Faces of Adam Smith," where one is about personal exchange and theory of moral sentiments, and the other is impersonal exchange in the marketplace and wealth of nations, and how the norms of personal exchange, what makes that efficient, don't apply to the impersonal exchange of the market. That'd be a cool thing to check out. But I think you're absolutely right. Now, what determines our institutional environment is a complex question that I don't think we all have great answers to. And sometimes it's context specific to a particular place. But certainly the ideology of the people plays a role in the type of economic systems that you get. And in the United States, our formal institutions of our Constitution and government were written down at a time where it was heavily classical liberal, influenced by thoughts of like John Locke and Adam Smith of the American founders. Since then, the ideology in the United States has gone from, as one of my friends wrote a book, From Liberty to Democracy, and thinking of what democracy does is good, as opposed to democracy as a method of choosing, and it might choose things that infringe upon our liberties, and we should really be protecting our liberties. But that's not what most Americans think now. They mistake democracy for the fundamental value rather than a means of choosing policies. And I think this leads to opening the door for things like Bernie Sanders in that election and saying, well, I'm for democracy, but I want democratic socialism. Whereas the founding generation of the United States would have said that this is a gross infringement upon our liberties. And that these things and external circumstances, I think you mentioned it in your opening remarks about India at independence coming out of colonialism. And I think it's not unique to India, but for all of the countries getting independence in the mid 20th century, there was a strong tendency to rebel against all things colonial, and they would mistake colonialism for capitalism and thus run towards a socialist economic system. And at the same time, whoever the elites were from these countries, if they got their education in the West, the dominant ideology intellectually at that time was some form of state ownership and management, at least of the commanding heights of the economy. So there's an ideological, like from below, pushback against all things colonialism and the mistake that colonialism was capitalism, which it's not. And the intellectual elite being trained that this is the way forward, is to plan your economy. And I think that's a great accident. I think the when you see in India's case, actually, like where you start getting your reforms, substantial ones, are the early 1990s, right? You have a financial crisis in 1991 and start moving towards more market orientated reforms in some sectors, at least then. And that's also partly a historical accident, right? Because while you got independence at the rise of socialist ideas, by 1991, it's the fall of the Soviet Union and, you know, Fukuyama, the end of history of everything's going to become liberal democratic now and more economically free and capitalist. So I think all of these things, outside circumstances as well as internal ideologies, play an important role.
Thank you so much, sir. Um, Indeed, there's a lot that I'm sure Anshu would like to follow up in your response, and we'll get there. Another area that I found interesting in your presentation was you mentioned that before Sweden embarked on its endeavor to constitute a welfare state, it had a long period of a smaller state, so to say, of around a century or so. Now, I'm interested in economic history, and I was going through one of Robert Allen's works, which he called Angel's Pause. And he points out that before you had, before let's say 1840 or so, you had a period in which there was a stagnation in workers' wages, and capitalists got more capital in order to reinvest, and this led to a growth in production per capita, and this had a later spillover effect. As far as wages went as well, in which wages increased more than, let's say, the rise in productivity necessarily. Now, if I were to think, now I see an analogy there already. So you pursue growth oriented policies, and you talk about redistribution later. Now, we have had economists say that in the Indian context as well. If I Based on our understanding, or at least my understanding of the challenge that the post-colonial leaders faced, part of the concern was how do we compress what the West, or at least parts of Western Europe, such as England, or the United States achieved over a long period of time into a shorter period of time. Now, interestingly, I was going through one of Abhijit Banerjee's works. He's a Nobel laureate, and he talks about how people tend to be irrational spenders. So they are on the verge of starving, and if they get something to spend, they would much rather go and spend it on a marriage or on a festival. And one implication seems to me that instead of static welfare considerations, industrial policy is more of a forced investment for long terms. And this is one reason why you had someone like Nehru, for instance, say that, oh, we need planning for the big, for initially. How, in the absence of planning, would you think of, let's say, a state which has a very weak industrial base replicate what the West did in its rise to ascendancy in a shorter period of time? Do you think it's possible?
Not only is it possible, it's happening all around us all the time. We just need to look to see it. So not in this book, but in my Out of Poverty book, the subtitle is Sweatshops on the Global Economy. And I described the process of, in Great Britain and the United States, from going from pre-industrial to something that is like developed post-sweatshop, good standards of living, is about 150 years in Great Britain, maybe 100 years in the United States. But the countries that were pre-industrial that just started attracting that type of investment post World War II. This is your South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong. All of them had a pre-industrial, like $350, $450 per person standard of living. And in a generation, 30 years, went from pre-industrial to first world status by 1980. And when you look today in countries that are getting some of this investment, Vietnam, and the growth that's happening there. Certainly the growth in coastal areas of China. A lot of this is market driven. So why does it happen faster? Well, where did the United States get its technology for the Industrial Revolution? It stole it from Great Britain. Where did it get some of the capital? It got invested from capitalists in Great Britain in the United States. So as a result, our process went faster. Why did East Asia go so much faster? Because there was so much more capital in the world that could be imported there and invested there, and the technology was so far ahead of the frontier that they were on that the process can happen much sooner. It's still a process, but so it's not overnight, but it happens just naturally in a market economy if you get your fundamental underlying causes of development right. So proximate causes of development are the technology, the capital, and the human capital. The underlying ones are your institutions. So good rule of law, strong private property rights, economic freedom, and even just improvements in those generate an inflow of foreign investment and a push up in growth rates that happens faster now than what it used to. So I would say that you don't need industrial policy for that. And in fact, that industrial policy, which was present in some of those East Asian economies that I've talked about, in other work, I've looked at those and I've shown, in fact, actually one of my former PhD students did something similar in India, but basically showed that the industrial policies promote forced industrialization, which makes stuff, but it doesn't reflect consumer preferences of like consumer subjective want satisfying economic growth. It diverges from making stuff from making what people want and need, so that the per capita GDP numbers look bigger, but people's actual living standards haven't improved proportionately to the improvement in GDP. And it's because forced industrialization is misdirecting capital and labor from where it can create the greatest value for the people.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Pal, for that wonderful answer. It sort of leads my mind to think about your book, Socialism Sucks, as well, in which you mentioned about Georgia's sort of transition from a into a post-Soviet economy, right? And in that regard, I just wanted to know from you, say, for example, you mentioned that Georgia, for example, is quite unique in the sense that it did not face the turmoil that maybe other nations had to face, often leading to corruption and other sorts of disillusionment. In fact, even in India, for example, before 1991, you would have a lot of rent seeking proprietary classes. And after the 1991 liberalization, like you rightly pointed out, there has been reforms in certain sectors, but it has only led to a sort of cronyism of type, in which select few have benefited to some extent, I'd say. So, based on your analysis, I just wanted to confirm from you, like, what do you see as the critical factors that differentiate successful transition to market economies from those that falter or regress? Is it the institutions that matter? Or is there something else, culture perhaps? Or how do you account for that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So there's a whole mix of things, and this is kind of like in talking about the uh, a previous answer where I said it's going to be a mix of culture, external circumstances, internal ideologies. Uh, in Georgia's case, I mean, they did stagnate for what, 16 years or so after the fall of the Soviet Union. They basically were unreformed through the whole 1990s till the early to mid 2000s. And then it's when Mikhail Saakashvili gets elected in the Rose Revolution and puts Kaha Bendikits, who's a radical libertarian, free market, almost anarchist, as the minister of the economy and gives him free rein to reform. And he goes in there on debureaucratization, which is basically firing huge amounts of government employees and abolishing agencies, liberalization of getting rid of the controls in the economy, and privatization and transparent privatization. They did it with auctions there. Rather than crony privatization that you see in a lot of other former socialist economies. And the reforms worked. It got Georgia growing and becoming more prosperous. I mean, they're still poor because they were starting very poor, and it takes time to compound. But they're about 33% or so wealthier than what we should expect them to be prior to the reforms. So there you kind of had a unique intellectual leadership with free rein for a while to make reforms, and then they actually amended. They have an economic freedom amendment in their constitution, so they've been out of power for over a dozen years now, and their economic freedoms aren't quite as high as they were, but they've basically been maintained because they made it hard to undo their policies, and that it's been relatively successful. So if you've seen the news, there's protests in Georgia, bad protests right now, and it's over the other political party that's been in power since then, who is moving them in a kind of anti-European Union, pro-Putin direction in foreign policy and in social policy, but they haven't really changed the economic policies too much, even though they'd be considered probably a center-left party, but they haven't basically killed the goose that's laying the golden eggs there. But I think in general, when you look at uh, former socialist economies, the ones who pursue shock therapy, radical privatization, liberalization quickly tend to be more successful. And there's economic studies that show this. The ones that move more gradual tend to not get very far because politics and economics aren't the same. And that, you know, with some of your interests in different economists and Mises, he talks about the dynamics of intervention, where you have one intervention that has undesirable secondary consequences and requires a new intervention to deal with it. Well, the same is true if you roll back gradually. If you roll back one intervention, you get the undesirable secondary consequences of something else that's still there. And that politically can create demand to stop reforming and to move in another direction. So I think politically, shock reform tends to work better if you get the moment of the break in the political equilibrium where you can actually do it. Um, and this is, by the way, the most interesting case playing out in the world right now, and that is Argentina. So Milei, aside from being a populist performer, ideologically has a lot in common with Caja Bendikits and the reforms in Georgia. And a lot of the things he says he'd like to do there are similar to their reforms. But of course, he doesn't dominate the legislature, so it's a question of what he can get through and sustain before the political process pushes back. But that's what I'm watching now with the most interest of anywhere in the world.
Just to follow up on that, since you mentioned about Argentina, and you also previously mentioned about the side of politics that plays a very important role as well. So, how do you look at, say, for example, Milei's reforms in the recent times? I mean, he's a libertarian, and I think we understand that pretty well. He's from the Libertarian Party. But at the same time, he's pushed for reforms like, say, I think, if I'm not wrong, banning abortion rights to some extent. So, how do you kind of reconcile and look at that? I mean, just intrigued.
Yeah, so that I'm separating economic policies from social policies, and that he's ideologically pushing towards the economic policies that would be libertarian. I think the abortion question's a hard one. Period. Actually, to me, I think now I'm taking off my economist hat, putting on just my person and generally libertarian outlook type idea. It seems to me that aborting a baby the day before it would naturally be born is wrong. And it also seems to me that taking a morning after pill is perfectly right. And that somewhere in between those 2 points, there's probably a line of right or wrong, and I'm not sure exactly where it is.
I see. That was quite an interesting answer. I think I personally also agree to a bit of those extents as well. Uh, to ask you on your book, Out of Poverty Sweatshops, because you brought that aspect in Pushkar's answer as well. You sort of make a very compelling case that, sweatshop jobs, despite the challenging notions that are attached to them, they're better off than the alternatives that people have, particularly in those developmental economies, because otherwise the alternatives for them are just agriculture or maybe manual scavenging, like you mentioned in the book, right? I just wanted to know from you because, a large segment of behavioral economics research to some extent has pointed out that, workers might make some irrational choices as well. Say, for example, they might prefer to have prefer more short-term gains over long-term gains, and in which case they might sort of be willing to accept less access to healthcare and safety reforms and some of those things as opposed to wages, right? And I think your study in Guatemala that you mentioned in the book, that workers preferring wages over safety to some extent does I think to some extent proves that point. So how do you, I mean, I think critics of this sort of come up with this argument that, in which case you would again need government intervention to secure the welfare of the people who are working at some of these sweatshops. So how do you look at that?
Yeah, that it's elitist bullshit. I think most of that's pretty strong. A lot of behavioral economics is bunk, and they just leave out various costs that would turn what they call irrational into rational. So I am for respecting people's preferences and not judging them and imposing my own view. And if workers do have a more short run uh, time horizon, time preference than long run, and are willing to trade off health and safety for current wages, who am I to judge that as, quote, irrational? I respect that they might have a different perspective on time preference. And in fact, due to their shitty circumstances, that might even influence their time preferences to preferring now compared to later, because later might not exist if you don't have a great life expectancy or have high variance of it. So I take their preferences as given rather than judging them and saying, I know best from the outside what your trade-offs you should be making. I strongly rebel against people who act that way with basically disregarding the uh, autonomy and preferences of the people who are struggling with their poverty. Um, and I did notice, by the way, while visiting India, and I didn't so we don't have a chapter in Socialism Sucks on India. If we were doing a second edition, and at one point we thought we were, the book did very well. It made it up to number 5 on Amazon's bestseller list, like overall, like in fiction books and everything. The publisher was game for a second edition, and we mapped out what we'd do for new chapters or intermezzos, and we had India in there. But this was in February of 2020. Then the world kind of went to hell, and our ability to travel around the world and do a second edition disappeared. And since then, the moment hasn't been right. Um, so I haven't delved well enough to talk intelligently about India things with you guys more than just a little bit. Uh, but I did notice I was told while I was visiting, and we went to Agua, that in the city, because of the Taj Mahal, there's no factories allowed, no textile factories allowed. And meanwhile, observing urban poverty there, of thinking this is insane. We're not allowing emissions while people are living in this type of poverty here. This would be a step up if they allowed factories here.
We have something very similar for Delhi as well, if I'm not wrong. I mean, you have a lot of pollution here in Delhi, and so there's like a lot of bans and impositions on factories near and around Delhi. And I think that's part of why Agra also has some of those restrictions as well. But I agree with you on your point as well. A lot of poverty. When if you look at from where we hosted the MPS and just go a mile or two around, nearby suburbs and slums, and this
Sure.
a stark difference between the airport area and the rest of the place. Now, Pushkar has a
Yeah,
question.
I did do a fair bit of that because I actually hated that we were in Aero City. I'm like, I didn't fly all the way to India to hang out in an airport.
Mm. Right, sir. I have a question at this moment on unions and an alternate conception of socialism or quote unquote socialism would argue that all right, they would grudgingly accept that okay, Hayek was right when he said that knowledge is decentralized, and that they don't want a command economy, so to say, but they'll maybe draw on someone like Luxembourg and say that all right, we need workers' councils or we need unions. Now, what is interesting to me at least is that in the case of India, and I'm putting forth a juxtaposition between India and Germany because I was reading a bit about Germany as well. And in India, Timothy Besley's works have shown that states which had more labor militancy, where the state had to make concessions to unions as opposed to allow passing legislation which backs or quote unquote backs employers, had a decline, or they did not see a productivity increase and an income increase necessarily to the extent of other states which saw more pro-employer legislation. Now, I find this an interesting contradiction to Germany, wherein during the financial crisis, so to say, instead the unions, instead of leading to some people being fired, actually called for a uniform decrease in everyone's wages, so that they accepted the fact that all right, wages have to decline, uh, but they saw a uniform decline as opposed to let's say some people suffering. And it was an interesting contradiction to how unions behave in different ways in different countries. How do you evaluate the role for unions, which don't call for a centralized command economy, but representing workers? How do you evaluate the role of unions in a free economy?
Not very much. So I do think people should have the freedom to collectively bargain together if they want to, but I am against laws that mandate that if a certain percentage of workers want to collectively bargain, everybody else has to do it with them too, which is in practice what union laws are. But in terms of economic development, they're mostly a sideshow for two reasons. One, so worker compensation, right? Upper bound is going to be limited by worker productivity. Lower bound is workers' next best alternative. A union at its best is about moving the wage within that bargaining range up towards the top. But already when we look across countries, about 85% of the variation we see in wages is determined by productivity differences. So particularly in the context of economic development, of like out of poverty to higher standards, it's about moving that upper bound of productivity, not the negotiating wage in between. And then even then, the main way that a union negotiates up is by restricting labor supply. Once it's a closed union shop and you have to use union workers, they limit the competition of how many they'll admit. So that's good for some workers, and it leaves other people stuck in poverty that's worse. So that's not widespread development. That's, rent seeking of a particular group for their benefit rather than society overall. So I don't think unions play an important role in the overall process of development. And in general, if they have any effect on the upper bound of productivity, it's that they tend to lower productivity actually because they make it harder to dismiss workers who are unproductive. Um,
Thank you, Professor, for that answer. In that regard, I mean, because we've sort of gotten into a discussion of unions as well, and I agree that unions are definitely not something that improve or increase productivity to a good extent. And this reminds me of a discussion that you have in your book, Out of Poverty Again, that pertains to child labor, for example. So you mentioned how unions, for example, collectively kind of tried to ban child labor in certain areas just so that they can oust out their competition because it helps them continue with their rent seeking model, right? In this regard, I just had a question for you. So, like, for example, say James Heckman, for example, he's mentioned how primary level education, I mean, at the very initial stage of a child's development, is really good for their cognitive and non cognitive processes, right? But at the same time, the stark economic reality is simply the fact that a lot of these children have no other better alternative but to be put into child labor for their, families to continue on with their subsistence, sort of, in some of these economies, right? So, would you, in such a scenario, vouch for the fact that you really do need state subsidized primary level or very basic level education to cater to the public at large? Maybe, how do you look at that?
yeah, I don't think so. So Also, a lot of child labor isn't incompatible with also getting education at the same time. Um, Particularly, and the child labor at that lowest basic primary level isn't nearly as high as it is once they get a little bit older. But I also think, and it's James Tooley's work that I've seen on this the most of, a lot of the government subsidized education in, in the United States too, but particularly in the developing world, isn't really public good education. It's public bad education of teaching about ideology of the political regime in power and such, rather than basic reading, writing skills that could lead to more productivity. But James Tooley's work is about private schools and finding in poor cities around the world the prevalence of low cost private education that parents are willing to pay for. Um, that does focus on uh, things that would enhance your productivity later. So I don't think massively. So in countries that are poor, massively subsidizing the state education system, I would not say is a recipe for improving human capital. I'd say it's a recipe for probably distorting it. And there's certainly no shortage of history of World Bank aid for education that has been a disaster in terms of economic outcomes. I'd recommend Bill Easterly's book, Elusive Quest for Growth, which has a chapter on aid for education. I do think, by the way, and I've written this, I think it's in the first edition, a new edition of Out of Poverty is coming out next month. Um, but for people who want to do charitable work in poorer countries, there's religious ones who do missionary schools, but other NGOs. If you want to reduce child labor in a way that's compatible with improving outcomes and education, found private schools and pay kids to go there. And if you do that with money that you raise in the outside, I don't see that as being antithetical to the process of development. And in the short run, it lowers child labor and maybe builds more of the human capital Heckman's talking about.
Right. We here at Center for Civil Society, because I also work at CCS as a fellow, I think, found remarkable success in the private budget school model as opposed to completely state-sponsored government education, which is pretty bad. I mean, that's terrible. So to move our conversation off to immigration, because you've also done significant work in that field with Alex, in your particular book, Wretched Refuse, you present a very strong case that, you know, immigrants do not necessarily degrade institutions or productivity of host countries, but in some cases also enhance them. And while economic efficiency is definitely something which I think is, I'd say, the most important consideration out there when it comes to open borders and immigration, you would have a lot of political theorists and philosophers who would come and say that, what about compatriot partiality and the fact that maybe states should be allowed to have a preferential treatment of their own citizens as opposed to people who they can consider as outsiders, perhaps. And I think this is an idea which has been used to sort of, like, for example, you see Trump's mass deportation right now. It's sort of this campaign that's on and about, and people supporting it to some extent as well, I think. If I'm not wrong, you also wrote on that just a couple of days back. I feel like I read that
Yep.
right. So, how do you sort of reconcile this economic and institutional benefits of immigration with the moral argument that these people put towards compatriot partiality and mass deportation and some of these things?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of ignorance about the social science consequences of immigration. And the reason I focused on the institutions and productivity one is because I think that's the most important one that, if true, would dramatically reduce the optimal number of immigrants. For the other ones, as long as you're going to massively increase productivity, which is what economists think happens with mass migration, um, uh, excuse me, not productivity purpose, but average output, global output. Uh, you have to be thoroughly uncreative, even if you're a nativist, to not figure out how to make the native born better off with that. So for the most part, it does not impact native born wages. But if you have huge gains to immigrants, a small immigrant surtax and a reallocation to natives who lose, you could fix this. As long as the pie gets much bigger with immigration, whatever problem you have with immigration, you could probably deal with it with some of that increased output. But there are some cultural things, and there's no economic argument against these. I had a former colleague who said, I don't want more Hispanic migration here because I don't want to have to push one for English when I use the phone. I said, okay, if that's your end, your view, economics doesn't have anything to say about it. I mean, I think letting people out of poverty and increasing global output compared to the inconvenience of you pushing one makes it immoral. But now we're in the realm of political philosophy and choices, not economics. Uh, I think there's a lot of people who, with mass migration, in India, you live with this, right? You have observed lived inequality side by side. In the United States, uh, it's not nearly as stark. If we allowed massive numbers of immigration in, global inequality would go down as their incomes go up, but lived inequality for native born Americans would go up and look more like what you deal with in India, and some people wouldn't like that. Um, these There are other trade-offs involved with immigration that aren't merely economic that some people don't like, and that means what's good economics is not necessarily good politics. When it comes to Trump's deportation, though, my expectation is that uh, he will do mostly people who have other criminal convictions and be able to say that it was the biggest in U.S. history, declare success and move on, because he just doesn't have the logistical capability to move out the sheer number that we have undocumented. And if he did, it would wreck industries like housing and farming, uh, and create economic consequences that would be politically unpopular. So I think he has to use his rhetoric and do something demonstrative in that direction, but not go too far. But then again, back in 2016, I thought he was doing the same thing with tariffs when he just did washing machines and something else. And then all of a sudden we had a trade war with China and Europe.
So just one final question before we take questions from the floor. And when framing this question, I had one of Leszek Kolakowski's writings in mind, the famous Polish philosopher who fought against communism in his home state. And he pointed out a tendency among, let's say, anti-capitalist thinkers to blame every conceivable socio-economic problem onto capitalism. So you find an issue and you link it to capitalism because that's an easy tactic through which you can get people to condemn the system in its entirety. Just link every possible problem to capitalism. And this sort of creates a whole package which is easy for people to subscribe to and it's easy to sloganize and therefore promulgate it. In contrast, concepts like, let's say, the market mechanism, price mechanism, and how it leaves everyone better off does not neatly align itself with the whole package, so to say. So Milley, for instance, can be against abortion, but he can be an economic liberal. So it does not neatly align itself with one complete package which is easy to circulate. As not just as an economist, but as someone who has written a book, Socialism Sucks, on how to convey such ideas, how do you think the market mechanism and free market economics can be popularized and promulgated not just in the American audience for which you have written the book, but also the countries that you have traveled to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's for intellectual entrepreneurs in those countries to figure out because I won't presume to know how to do it from here. I've got some ideas in the United States, and some of my other friends have other ideas. But I do think you're exactly right, and this is about the anti-market mentality. So when we went to the largest socialist conference in the United States at the end of this book, most of the young people we talked to there, you ask them, why are you socialist? And they would tell you a social issue that wasn't about nationalizing the means of production. So it could have been abortion rights. It could have been transgender gay rights. It could have been migration rights. It could be minority racial things, any number of political issues that someone told them socialism is for equality and ending oppression, and they said, therefore, I'm for socialism. And I said, oh, so you mean like the government should own Walmart? Oh, no, I don't think about it like that. Well, maybe we need to start better communicating what socialism actually is. And as we also point out in the end of the book, uh, we actually have sympathies with a lot of the people who were at this conference and claimed to be socialist in terms of things that they thought were injustices in the United States. It's just we think that the answer is actually more freedom and liberty for people and less government, not the answer being collectivized the means of production. And that's a message that I think what you're asking is I don't know if there's a universal answer to how to better communicate that, but I think it's for people like CCS in India to figure out how to better communicate it in India. And I'm not sure I have any particularly great knowledge about that. But I know we're also just about out of time here, and I've got some other work I've got to do, but I do want to take a couple questions from everybody else if people have something, and I'll try to keep my answers short.
Thank you, Professor Pal, for your time. especially to have this moderated discussion. I'd like to open the floor for the audience to ask their questions. You can put your questions in the chat box and we'll just direct them to Professor Pal. So feel free to go ahead. Okay, Shubh has asked a question. Can you see the chat box or will I read it out to you? I think that would be better.
Yeah, I can see it now.
Uh,
Yeah, so I'm not an expert, of course, on the Indian caste system as you all are, but it would my suspicion. So in general, my view, and this is related to like race and economics as well. Um, on the margin, market competition limits racism in the United States and other places because you pay the consequences of losing gains from trade you could otherwise secure by not interacting with people because of bigoted preferences. And my suspicion is that the more market orientated India would become, the more pressure on the caste system of violating its norms would exist because there'd be economic gains from doing so. And I say that just tentatively without great knowledge of it.
I would agree to you actually. There have been some scholars from Mercatus who have actually worked on the caste equation in India when they came back to India after their PhD. So that's definitely there. Does anyone have any other questions? Otherwise, we can just proceed to a vote of thanks and end this event. Well, that doesn't appear to be the case. I've also sent the YouTube link for the Free Market Institute. I find the resources to be extremely useful, so do check that out. I'll Pushkar, you can go ahead with the formal vote of thanks and we have this.
Well, it seems people are hesitant to send questions because Professor Powell is in a hurry. Nevertheless, I assure you, if Professor Powell is free sometime in the future, we'll catch hold of him once again whenever his schedule permits. I'll proceed with the vote of thanks, nevertheless.
Hey,
So,
one thing before you do, I will say for any budding economists in here who are eventually looking to go on and study it professionally to become a PhD, one of the big things we do at the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech is train people to become professors of economics, and we offer fellowships for PhD study. So you should check out the institute if that is something that interests you as graduate work in economics. Uh, I'll type our web address into the chat box. Now, please, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
yeah, thanks. Anshu, just send the link to the group, to our WhatsApp group once as well, right? From the chat box, just send it over. Right. So, on behalf of Caucus the Discussion Forum, it's my pleasure to thank Professor Benjamin Powell for addressing us on Economics and Liberty Lessons from Central Planning. His book and his talk today covered a wide range of countries, therefore, a wider set of case studies from which we can learn mistakes not to repeat, and he sort of converged with several economic trajectories that post colonial India followed, and therefore, it was indeed enlightening to listen to Professor Powell's responses to our largely India centric questions, but also our questions on his books. It was indeed a pleasure to listen to such a vociferous exposition of free market economics, of laissez-faire economics, given the fact that we sort of are surrounded by a din, not the Hindi din, by the way, sort of a din of a statist vision of economic policies. I would like to thank everyone who joined today's session. My apologies for taking a lot of for the moderated session taking a lot of time. We couldn't open questions to the floor. But as I said, we assure you that we'll host Professor Powell whenever his schedule permits again, and we may keep it entirely audience-centric. Thank you so much, sir, for answering all our questions. I would like to also extend my gratitude to our teacher in charge, Dr. Saurabh Kumar. I think he has had to leave the meeting though. Once again, thank you to everyone who joined. It's pretty late here, 10:20 p.m., but it's pretty early for Professor Powell, and he'll have to get off and work. So I'll end it at that. Thank you so much, Professor Powell.
Thank you, guys.